The community center's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the folding chairs arranged in neat rows, where 37 residents of Willowbrook Estates had gathered for the monthly HOA meeting. I sat in the back corner, my worn leather portfolio balanced on my lap, listening to the familiar drone of committee reports and budget discussions that had become the soundtrack to these Tuesday evening gatherings. From my position near the exit, I had a clear view of the neighborhood's power structure in action. At the front table sat Richard Pemberton, our HOA president for the past 8 years, his silver hair perfectly styled and his navy blazer projecting the kind of authority that came from managing million-dollar homes and their equally expensive owners. To his right, Margaret Hamilton held court with her usual imperious bearing, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she gestured dismissively at various agenda items. Mrs. Hamilton had made her feelings about my presence in Willowbrook Estates clear from the moment I'd moved into the modest duplex on Maple Lane 6 months ago. While her neighbors lived in sprawling colonials with manicured lawns and 3-car garages, my property was a simple 2-unit building that I'd purchased as an investment opportunity. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned considerably more real estate than anyone in this room could imagine. Before we adjourn, Richard announced, consulting his leather-bound agenda, Mrs. Hamilton has requested to address some concerns about property maintenance standards. I straightened in my chair, already knowing where this was heading. Margaret Hamilton stood with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention, her silk blouse and pearls making a statement about class and propriety that she clearly felt was lost on some residents. "Thank you, Richard," she began, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who'd grown up attending cotillion and charity galas. "I want to discuss a matter that affects all of our property values and the character of our community." She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on me with unmistakable intent. "We've always prided ourselves on maintaining certain standards in Willowbrook Estates. When people invest in homes here, they expect their neighbors to share their commitment to excellence." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was calculating exactly how much excellence some of these residents had actually invested in their properties. My real estate analysis software had detailed records on every transaction in the neighborhood, including the mortgage amounts, down payments, and current market values that many of these homeowners preferred to keep private. "Recently," Mrs. Hamilton continued, "we've seen a decline in the aesthetic standards that make our community special. Specifically, the duplex property on Maple Lane has become a concern for several residents." Now the attention was focused entirely on me. I felt the weight of 36 pairs of eyes assessing my presence, my modest dress, my obvious lack of membership in their exclusive social circle. "The property itself is acceptable," Mrs. Hamilton conceded with forced diplomacy, "but the maintenance standards and overall presentation don't align with our community values. We've received multiple complaints about issues that affect surrounding property values." I remained silent, waiting for her to specify exactly what violations she was alleging. The duplex was immaculately maintained. I'd hired the same landscaping company that serviced half the homes in the neighborhood, and the building had been recently painted and updated with new windows and roofing. Furthermore, Mrs. Hamilton's voice gained strength as she warmed to her subject, "We need to consider the long-term implications of allowing properties that don't meet our standards. People like her shouldn't live here if they can't maintain the level of investment and commitment that the rest of us have made." The phrase hit the room like a physical force. People like her. The coded language was clear to everyone present, though Mrs. Hamilton was careful to frame it in terms of property standards rather than more obvious prejudices. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Margaret, I think we should focus on specific maintenance issues rather than making broad statements about residents." "I am focusing on maintenance," she replied sharply. "The duplex rental model attracts transient tenants who don't have the same investment in community standards as homeowners. It's a fundamental mismatch with what Willowbrook Estates represents." I stood slowly, feeling the conversation had gone far enough. Every eye in the room tracked my movement as I gathered my portfolio and purse. "I appreciate everyone's concerns about property values," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "I'll certainly take your feedback into consideration." Mrs. Hamilton's smile was coldly triumphant. "I'm sure you understand that we're all working toward the same goal, preserving what makes our neighborhood special. I nodded politely, though my mind was already working through the implications of what I'd just witnessed. These people had made assumptions about my financial situation, my commitment to the community, and my right to live among them based on nothing more than the fact that I'd chosen to purchase a duplex rather than a single-family mansion. As I walked toward the exit, I heard Mrs. Hamilton's voice resuming behind me. Now, regarding the upcoming landscaping assessments, I think we need to be more aggressive about enforcement. The community center's automatic doors slid shut behind me, cutting off the continued discussion of my alleged shortcomings. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air and watching the lights in the expensive homes that surrounded the building. What Mrs. Hamilton and her allies didn't know was that I owned Meridian Property Management, one of the region's most successful real estate investment firms. The modest duplex they were so concerned about was actually part of a portfolio that included over 200 rental properties across 3 states, generating annual revenue in the millions. I'd chosen to live in Willowbrook Estates not because it was the only place I could afford, but because I was researching the neighborhood for potential investment opportunities. The HOA meeting had just accelerated that timeline considerably. I drove home to my duplex, noting with sardonic amusement that my substandard property was better maintained than several of the homes whose owners had sat silently while Mrs. Hamilton attacked my presence in their community. The irony wasn't lost on me that these people were so concerned about property values while remaining completely unaware of the actual real estate market forces that determine those values. In my home office, I opened my laptop and accessed the Meridian Property Management database. Within minutes, I had detailed financial profiles for every property in Willowbrook Estates, including mortgage balances, payment histories, and market valuations. What I found was illuminating. Several of Mrs. Hamilton's allies were significantly underwater on their mortgages, having purchased during the market peak and now owing more than their homes were worth. More interesting was the information about Pemberton Property Services, Richard's HOA management company. A quick search through business registration records revealed that Richard had been looking for a buyer for his firm for the past 6 months, citing his desire to retire and spend more time with his grandchildren in Florida. I smiled as I reached for my phone. Sometimes opportunity presented itself in the most unexpected ways. The acquisition of Pemberton Property Services took exactly 3 weeks to complete. Richard was thrilled to find a buyer willing to pay his asking price without extensive negotiations, and my legal team structured the deal through Meridian Holdings to maintain confidentiality during the transition period. As far as Richard knew, he was selling to a well-capitalized investment firm with extensive experience in property management. During the due diligence process, I learned fascinating details about Willowbrook Estates' financials and governance. The HOA's reserves were lower than residents realized. Several major infrastructure projects had been deferred due to cost concerns, and there were ongoing disputes about assessment increases that Richard had been struggling to manage diplomatically. I also discovered that Mrs. Hamilton had been pressuring Richard for months to implement stricter enforcement policies targeting properties she considered undesirable. Her complaints about my duplex were just the latest in a series of campaigns she'd waged against residents who didn't meet her personal standards for the neighborhood. The transition meeting was scheduled for the following month's HOA gathering, where Richard would announce his retirement and introduce the new management company. I spent the intervening weeks studying every aspect of Willowbrook Estates operations, from landscaping contracts to architectural review procedures, preparing for the moment when Mrs. Hamilton would learn exactly who would be managing her complaints going forward. The October HOA meeting drew a larger crowd than usual, with residents curious about Richard's announced retirement and what changes might be coming to their community management. I took my usual seat in the back corner, noting that Mrs. Hamilton had positioned herself prominently in the front row, clearly expecting to play a significant role in vetting whoever would be taking over Richard's responsibilities. "Before we begin tonight's agenda," Richard announced, his voice carrying a note of excitement, "I want to share some important news about the future of our community management." He gestured toward a woman in a business suit who'd been sitting quietly near the front. "This is Jennifer Walsh from Meridian Property Management, the company that will be taking over HOA operations when I retire next month." Jennifer stood and addressed the room with practiced professionalism. "Thank you, Richard. Meridian Property Management is excited to partner with Willowbrook Estates. We specialize in premium residential communities and have extensive experience managing properties similar to yours. Mrs. Hamilton raised her hand immediately. What's your company's policy regarding property standards and enforcement? We've had some challenges with residents who don't maintain appropriate standards for our community. That's an excellent question, Jennifer replied smoothly. Meridian believes in fair and consistent enforcement of community standards. However, we also believe that property standards should be based on objective criteria rather than subjective preferences. I saw Mrs. Hamilton's expression tighten slightly at the diplomatic pushback. Our approach, Jennifer continued, focuses on actual violations of recorded covenants rather than personal opinions about what constitutes appropriate housing for the neighborhood. I'm not sure I understand the distinction, Mrs. Hamilton said, her voice taking on an edge. Some situations require judgment calls about community character and long-term property values. Meridian's owner has been very clear about this policy, Jennifer said. All enforcement decisions must be based on documented covenant violations, not assumptions about residents or property types. Mrs. Hamilton's frustration was becoming visible. Could we meet with this owner to discuss specific situations? There are ongoing issues that require someone with decision-making authority. Jennifer smiled. Actually, the owner is here tonight. She wanted to observe the community dynamics before formally introducing herself. The room stirred with curiosity as residents looked around, trying to identify which of the unfamiliar faces might be the mysterious owner of their new management company. She's been attending meetings for several months, Jennifer continued, getting a feel for the community and its needs. I stood slowly from my seat in the back corner, feeling the familiar weight of attention as every head turned in my direction. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Hamilton's face went through a remarkable transformation, confusion giving way to recognition, then shock, then something approaching horror as the implications became clear. Good evening, I said, my voice carrying easily through the stunned silence. I'm Marina Rodriguez, owner of Meridian Property Management. I'm looking forward to working with all of you to maintain Willowbrook Estates as the exceptional community it's always been. The silence stretched for several seconds before Richard found his voice. Marina, I had no idea. You've been living here all along? Yes, in the duplex on Maple Lane. The property that's been generating so much concern about community standards. Mrs. Hamilton remained frozen in her seat, her carefully constructed composure completely shattered. Around the room, other residents were processing the revelation with expressions ranging from embarrassment to curiosity to barely concealed amusement. I want to address some misconceptions that seem to exist about property values and community standards, I continued. Over the past 6 months, I've been conducting a comprehensive analysis of Willowbrook Estates' real estate market performance. I opened my portfolio and pulled out a prepared report. The duplex on Maple Lane, far from lowering property values, has actually performed better than the neighborhood average in terms of maintenance, aesthetic improvements, and market appreciation. Mrs. Hamilton finally found her voice. This is highly irregular. How can the owner of the management company also be a resident? There's an obvious conflict of interest. There's no conflict, I replied calmly. If anything, having an owner who lives in the community ensures that management decisions will be made with genuine understanding of residents' needs and concerns. I looked directly at Mrs. Hamilton, including concerns about property standards and community character. I've had the opportunity to observe firsthand how some residents approach these issues. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Hamilton had spent months criticizing my presence in the community, unaware that she was attacking the person who would soon control every aspect of HOA enforcement and policy. Going forward, I said, addressing the room, Meridian Property Management will implement transparent, objective standards for all enforcement actions. Every decision will be documented and based on clearly defined covenant violations rather than subjective judgments about what constitutes appropriate housing or suitable residence. The message was clear to everyone present. The era of arbitrary enforcement based on personal preferences was over. Over the following months, Willowbrook Estates underwent a subtle but significant transformation under Meridian's management. Property maintenance standards were enforced consistently and fairly, with clear guidelines that applied equally to all residents regardless of their home's size or value. Several long-overdue infrastructure projects were initiated using more competitive bidding processes that reduced costs while improving quality. Mrs. Hamilton made few appearances at subsequent HOA meetings, and when she did attend, her contributions were notably more measured and diplomatic. The reality of having her community managed by the person she'd tried to exclude had apparently provided valuable perspective on the importance of treating all residents with respect. As for my duplex on Maple Lane, it continued to be one of the best-maintained properties in the neighborhood. I eventually converted it to a single-family home, not because of any community pressure, but because the market analysis showed it would optimize the property's long-term value. The transformation taught me something valuable about assumptions and appearances. Mrs. Hamilton and her allies had looked at my modest housing choice and assumed it reflected financial limitations or lack of commitment to the community. They never considered that someone might choose to live simply while building something much larger behind the scenes. In the end, their concern about property values proved prophetic, just not in the way they'd expected. Under Meridian's management, property values in Willowbrook Estates increased by an average of 12% over the following year, making it one of the best-performing neighborhoods in the region. And the people like her, who Mrs. Hamilton had worried about? It turned out we were exactly the kind of people the neighborhood needed.